There's a check waiting at the end of the Cincinnati Open draw worth close to $200,000, and here's the twist. That's probably the least interesting thing Alex Eala could walk away with this week, because underneath the prize money and the seeding and the storylines about a rising Filipino star, there's a number quietly ticking in the background that could reshape the next 2 years of her career. And almost nobody talking about this tournament is paying attention to it. So, let's start with the part that sounds almost too strange to be true. This is a tournament where Alex Eala genuinely cannot lose. Not in the emotional sense. Obviously, losing a tennis match still stings, but in the cold mathematical sense that governs how professional rankings actually work. And to understand why, you need a quick lesson in how the WTA ranking system operates. Because it's not as simple as just adding up points from your best results. The system runs on a rolling calendar, 52 weeks long, and every single week that passes, two things happen at once. You can add new points from whatever you play that week, but you also lose whatever points you earned exactly 1 year earlier in that same week. They just disappear automatically, whether you're healthy or hurt, whether you showed up or stayed home. That's the quiet tax every player on tour pays just to stand still. Most of the field walking into Cincinnati this week is playing defense before they've even hit a ball, trying to protect points they banked 12 months ago. But Alex Eala isn't one of them, and here's why. Back in 2025, she was forced to withdraw from this exact tournament with a shoulder injury, which means on the ranking calendar, this week shows up as a blank page for her. 0 points earned last year, which means 0 points to defend this year. Every single match she wins in Mason is pure profit. Nothing gets subtracted anywhere else. Picture two players running toward the same finish line. One of them is sprinting up a downward moving escalator just to stay in place. The other one is simply running up a normal staircase. Same physical effort, wildly different outcome. And that's exactly the gap between Eala and almost everyone else in that locker room this week. A loss costs her almost nothing, and a win is worth more than what shows up on the prize money chart, because this isn't really about the check at all. Now layer onto that the fact that Eala arrives in Cincinnati seated 17th. The highest seeding of her entire career at this level of tournament. A bump she received after several higher-ranked players, including Karolina Muchova, Victoria Azarenka, and Jasmine Paolini, were forced to withdraw through injury, and landing inside that top 32 bracket buys her something valuable beyond just the label. It buys her a bye straight through the opening round. No round of 128 for her. She steps directly into the round of 64, with extra recovery days built in during arguably the most physically demanding stretch of her whole season. So on paper, stack it all up, career high seeding, 0 points at risk, a free pass through the opening round, and she's playing the best tennis of her life walking in. That's about as close to a perfect setup as professional tennis ever hands anyone. And if you know anything about how people who think about risk for a living evaluate opportunities, this is precisely the kind of situation they chase. Almost nothing to lose and enormous upside sitting right there for the taking, and remarkably, Eala landed in exactly that scenario completely by accident. The shoulder injury that kept her out a year ago is the very thing that turned this week into a risk-free swing. But here's where the fairy tale setup runs straight into a much messier reality. Because a perfect ranking situation on paper means absolutely nothing if the draw itself is a minefield, and this one is her opening match in the round of 64 puts her across the net from Elena Gabriela Ruse of Romania, a player she has never beaten, not once. They've only met a single time before, back in the 2024 US Open qualifying rounds. Eala actually won the opening set, then dropped the next two, and lost the match entirely, 6-3. 1-6, 6-4. So despite Ruse sitting 77 spots below her in the current rankings, the head-to-head sits at 0 wins for Eala against a player she's technically well ahead of on paper. And Ruse isn't walking into this match cold either. Just last week in Toronto, she was down a set and trailing 4 games to love in the second against Peyton Stearns before clawing her way all the way back to win it in straight sets. That's not a player who folds when the scoreboard turns ugly. That's a competitor who digs in. So despite the seeding gap suggesting an easy passage, the actual matchup tells a very different story, and it raises an uncomfortable question. Why does a 17-spot advantage on the rankings sheet mean almost nothing once you actually step onto the court? And the answer, as always in this sport, comes down to lived experience. Ruse has beaten her before, and that kind of psychological memory doesn't just vanish. Now let's say Eala gets through that first test, because the draw doesn't get easier from there. it gets stranger. Round 3 would likely bring her face-to-face with Amanda Anisimova, the world's 10th-ranked player and a two-time Grand Slam finalist, an American competing on American soil with a home crowd behind her in the last major tune-up before the US Open. And here's the detail that should make you a little nervous if you're rooting for Eala. These two have never played each other. Not once, anywhere, no history, no scouting report built from lived experience, no muscle memory of how Anisimova's ball comes off her racket. One of the cleanest, flattest hitters anywhere in the sport. That's not simply a tough matchup. That's a coin flip happening completely in the dark. And if she somehow survives that too, round 4 brings arguably the cruelest possible name, Linda Noskova, the reigning Wimbledon champion. And this is where the draw stops being merely difficult and starts feeling almost designed to punish her, because Eala has already faced Noskova twice this year and lost both times. And it's not just the losses that sting. It's how lopsided they were. At Indian Wells in the round of 16, Noskova took it 6-2, 6-love, handing Eala a single game across the entire second set. Then at the Berlin semifinals, it was closer, but the outcome identical, 6-2, 6-4, same winner, same problem unsolved. So if Noskova has already beaten her twice in the past 6 months, with one of those wins bordering on a straight sets demolition, what exactly would be different a third time around? 6 months isn't a long runway to fix a matchup that's already given you 2 beatings, and beyond round 4, this stops being a conversation about style clashes and starts being a conversation about the absolute ceiling of the entire sport, because the projected quarterfinal opponent is Jessica Pegula, the world's 3rd-ranked player. The projected semi-final brings either Iga Swiatek or Elena Rybakina, and the projected final would be against either Aryna Sabalenka or Coco Gauff, meaning the top 3 players in the entire sport are all sitting somewhere on Eala's side of this bracket. And here's the thing, none of that is purely theoretical for her. She's already proven she can string together wins against elite competition on American hard courts in August. She did exactly that in Washington a few weeks ago, beating the defending champion Leylah Fernandez, then the 10th-ranked player in the world, then a 4-time Grand Slam champion in Naomi Osaka, and finally the world's 3rd-ranked player in the final itself. She's also beaten both Swiatek and Rybakina within the past 2 months, so the ceiling isn't some fantasy scenario. It's genuinely within reach. The real question isn't whether she has the game to get there, it's whether her body can survive the journey. And that brings us to the number that nobody is really talking about. Forget the massive winners check for a second. Forget the ranking points too. The number that actually matters most to Alex Eala this week is 16. And here's why that number carries so much weight at a Grand Slam tournament. The draw includes 128 players and 32 seeds, but those seeds aren't treated as one uniform group. The bracket is constructed so the top 16 seeds are kept apart from each other, meaning if you're seated somewhere inside that top 16, you literally cannot face another top 16 player until the 4th round at the earliest. Read that again. You're protected from the sport's best players for 3 full rounds. Right now, Eala sits at 20 in the world, which puts her in the 17 through 32 seeding band, exposed, meaning she could theoretically run into an elite top 16 opponent as early as round 3 at the US Open. That's the difference between a sheltered path and a minefield at the richest, most prestigious event on the entire calendar. And this isn't some obscure stat that only spreadsheet nerds care about. Former world number 1 and US Open champion Andy Roddick pointed this exact thing out on his podcast right after Eala's Washington title run, calling her sneaky close, noting she's only about 4 spots away from cracking that protected top 16 tier, and he specifically named this as her next real target. Can she put together a couple of strong results across Canada and Cincinnati and sneak inside that group before the US Open begins? And the math backing that idea up is actually more forgiving than you'd expect, because Eala has 0 points to defend in Cincinnati, having never played a main draw match here before. She currently sits roughly 240 points behind Ekaterina Alexandrova, who occupies the 19th spot, meaning a strong run, even just reaching the quarterfinals or semifinals, could realistically be enough to push her into the top 16 for the very first time in her career. And here's the part that makes this genuinely exciting rather than just statistically interesting. She doesn't need some miracle run to get there. She doesn't need to beat Pegula. She doesn't need to solve the Noskova puzzle. She doesn't even need to lift the trophy. She just needs to win a handful of matches. That's the entire equation. That's what's genuinely on the line in Ohio this week. A couple of solid wins here could quietly restructure her entire path through the US Open, and by extension, the single biggest financial and career-defining stretch of her season. Think of Cincinnati not as the final exam, but as the qualifying round for the actual final exam. You might have clicked on this expecting a story about one enormous high-stakes gamble on a single draw, but that's not really what this is. This is the week she buys the ticket for a much bigger opportunity down the line. And now here's the piece of this story that genuinely reshaped how I think about the whole situation. Because there's a second assumption buried underneath all of this that almost everyone accepts without question. We're conditioned to believe that going deep in a tournament is always good and losing early is always bad. And in tennis, generally speaking, that's true. But this particular week, for this particular player, that logic might actually flip. Some sharp observers covering her draw raised something worth sitting with. If Eala loses early in Cincinnati, that disappointing result might actually work in her favor. And here's why. She just played 8 matches across 7 days. She rolled her ankle during a grueling 3-set battle in Toronto. She won precisely 0 games in an entire set less than 2 weeks ago against Belinda Bencic, and the US Open, the tournament that actually determines her financial future and legacy, begins in barely 2 weeks. An early exit in Ohio hands her something no amount of prize money can buy at this exact point on the calendar. Time: 10 days of focused practice instead of grinding through 5-setters. 10 days with physiotherapists instead of ice baths after night matches. 10 days to arrive in New York with fresh legs instead of dragging an exhausted body through a 4th consecutive tournament. So look at the shape of this entire week once you strip it down. If she wins matches, she climbs toward that protected top 16 seeding, and she loses nothing in the rankings because there's nothing there to lose. If she loses matches, she gains a recovery window she hasn't had access to since July, and she still loses nothing in the rankings because, again, there's nothing there to lose. There is genuinely no version of this week where Alex Eala walks away worse off than she walked in. And that's not how tennis normally works. In every other week of her season, a loss costs her points, costs her seeding position, costs her momentum. This week, a loss costs her almost nothing and might quietly be doing her a favor. And a win is worth considerably more than the number printed on the prize money chart. Because none of this was ever really about the money. Now let's talk honestly about the part of the story that has fans and analysts genuinely worried, because Alex Eala's body has been through an absolute war this summer. Between the 28th of July and the 10th of August, the 21-year-old played 8 matches in just 7 days. And no, that's not a typo. 8 matches, 7 days. 5 of them to capture the title in Washington, 3 more immediately after in Toronto, including a brutal 3-set battle against Katie McNally, where she rolled her ankle mid-match while Filipino fans watching around the world held their breath. She won that match anyway, extending a 7-match winning streak, the longest run of her career, and at that moment the longest active streak anywhere on the WTA Tour. And then Belinda Bencic happened. For games to 6, love games to 6, over just 73 minutes. That's how quickly the Swiss veteran exposed weeks of accumulated fatigue. Eala landed under half of her first serves, barely a third of her second serves, won only about a quarter of her return points, and didn't win a single game in that second set. Afterward, analysts covering the tournament used a phrase that stuck with a lot of people, describing her as looking like she was teetering on the edge of burnout. And that wasn't hyperbole from an overheated fan account. That was a sober read from people whose entire job is watching this sport closely. The numbers behind all this are staggering when you actually total them up. 56 matches played across 21 tournaments in 2026 alone, more than any other player on the entire WTA Tour this season. She's been taped up for months now, shoulder, ankle, and fans have started noticing the heavy strapping on her left arm during recent matches. The executive director of the Philippine Tennis Federation, Tonit Mendoza, who's watched this entire journey up close, put it plainly, explaining that the fatigue in Canada was obvious after the physical toll of playing every single round in Washington, and expressing hope that Eala could find real rest before Cincinnati and the US Open. But not everyone shares that concern. Greg Ruzetsky, the 1997 US Open finalist and former world number 4, dismissed the fatigue narrative outright on his own podcast, insisting there's no chance of it derailing her, acknowledging the workload is real, but pointing out that winning a major requires stringing together 7 consecutive victories, something she's already proven she can do. He emphasized that physically she already looks to be in strong shape, mentally tough, and that youth allows the body to bounce back far quicker than it does for players in their 30s, concluding he simply isn't worried, expecting her to play Cincinnati, take a week to prepare, and arrive at the US Open the same way every top player does. And Eala herself has handled the conversation around her body with a level of maturity that honestly stands out. After Toronto, she openly admitted to feeling about as tired as a player possibly can at this point in a season, without hiding behind excuses, but she also stressed that she remains healthy, calling that something she's deeply grateful for, and insisting that staying healthy will always be her top priority. She then took a couple of days completely away from tennis, got a haircut, got her nails done, spent time with friends in Cincinnati, saying plainly that she wanted to get her mind off the sport and actually enjoy time away from the court. That's not the behavior of someone gritting their teeth through an unsustainable schedule. That's a 21-year-old who already understands the concept of load management better than plenty of players twice her age. There's a meaningful difference between being exhausted and simply being tired, and everything coming out of her own mouth points toward the latter. Still, the reality remains that a deep run through this brutal gauntlet, Anisimova, Noskova, Pegula, Swiatek, Sabalenka, could push her body dangerously close to its limit just 2 weeks before the most important tournament of her career, while an early exit would hand her exactly what money simply cannot buy right now: time. 10 days of practice instead of matches, 10 days with her physio team instead of back-to-back night sessions, 10 days to walk into New York with legs that actually feel fresh instead of legs dragging through a 4th straight event. And really, the question isn't whether Alex Eala can physically handle this workload, it's whether she should, and that's a decision that ultimately belongs to her and the team around her alone. So let's pull everything together, because that number splashed across headlines, the prize money sitting at the end of this draw, isn't really what this week is about at all. That check is real, and it's more money than she's earned across this entire historic season combined, but it's also probably the least important prize sitting in that building right now. What's actually being decided in Mason, Ohio this week is the number 16, and everything that number unlocks. 2 weeks in New York with a structurally protected path through the sport's biggest stage, 3 rounds shielded from the game's elite instead of walking and exposed from round 3 onward. And there's something almost poetic about where all of this would eventually lead, because Flushing Meadows is the exact place where Eala won the US Open girls singles title back in 2022 at just 17 years old. It's where she recorded her first ever Grand Slam main draw victory. It's the court that has produced more defining moments in her career than anywhere else on earth, and she'd be walking back onto those same grounds for years later as a seeded top 20 player and a WTA Tour champion, returning to the exact place where this entire story began. That's the loop that could quietly close this month. And there's a bigger picture sitting behind all of it too.